Welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely pumped to share today's story with you, mostly because it plays out exactly like a gripping, high-stakes spy thriller. Picture this. It's 1776. We're in the murky, unpredictable waters of New York Harbor. On one side, you've got literally the most powerful military force on the planet. And on the other, a lone engineer peddling a bizarre, tar-covered wooden craft right beneath the waves. It was a highly classified, incredibly desperate attempt to turn the tide of the American Revolution. Okay, let's dive into this. When we look back at the American Revolution, we usually think of muskets, open fields, traditional generals on horseback. But right at the very start of the conflict, there was an operation so secretive and honestly so unprecedented that it almost defies belief. So we have to ask ourselves, was this strange craft, known as the Turtle, just a crude, doomed-to-fail invention born out of sheer panic? Or are we actually looking at the true precursor to a century of highly classified, sophisticated underwater warfare? To really answer that, we have to grasp the terrifying reality that the Americans were facing at that exact moment. 130. Imagine standing on the shores of Manhattan in the sweltering summer of 1776. You look out at the horizon and you don't just see a few boats bobbing out there. You see what looks like a literal forest of ship masts, just completely blocking out the sky. That was the massive British Armada, 130 heavily armed warships, carrying 25,000 troops. And they were arriving with one single, terrifying purpose: to completely crush the American Revolution before it even really began. The sheer scale of this threat arriving on the shores of New York was absolutely staggering. And this brilliantly illustrates the unbelievable mismatch of this entire conflict. On one hand, you have the ragtag Continental Army. George Washington had absolutely zero navy, literally none. And yet, he somehow had hundreds of miles of highly vulnerable New York shoreline to protect. Against them stood this British Armada, which was essentially the 18th century version of the Death Star, just suddenly appearing right in their backyard. We are talking about an overwhelming, empire-crushing force of unmatched naval superiority. So George Washington was quite literally backed into a corner. Traditional warfare? Yeah, that was definitely not going to save him here. The absolute desperation of the situation forced his hand. He obviously couldn't just build 130 warships overnight, so he needed a miracle. Or, failing a miracle, he needed a very big, very dangerous secret. And that sheer desperation is exactly what led him to authorize the use of an unimaginable weapon. We're talking about a weapon that most people alive at that time couldn't even begin to conceptualize, let alone actually build. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that it brings us face to face with the Turtle, the world's very first combat submarine. And to be clear, this wasn't some theoretical drawing tucked away in a notebook. This was a highly classified, fully operational, one-person craft specifically designed for stealth underwater torpedo missions. It was an absolute masterpiece of try-anything engineering. Because let's face it, when you have zero navy, you have to get incredibly creative. The Turtle was the ultimate manifestation of American ingenuity under an extreme existential threat. Let's break down exactly how this crazy machine actually worked, because the engineering here is just fascinating. Step 1. Picture a giant man-sized oak barrel. To make it watertight, they completely covered and sealed the whole thing in thick, sticky black tar. Step 2, propulsion. It only fit one person, right? So to move it through the dark water, the lone engineer inside had to physically pedal a mechanism, kind of like riding an extremely terrifying underwater bicycle. Step 3, the weapon itself. The operator had to sneak underwater, use a hand-operated drill to physically bore into the enemy ship's hull, and then attach a keg of gunpowder with a timed fuse. I mean, just imagine the claustrophobia for a second. You are quite literally pedaling a dark wooden bomb barrel through pitch-black waters, relying entirely on your own physical stamina. No pressure, right? Let's move to and see how this builds, because they didn't just test this thing out in a safe, quiet pond. Oh no, they went straight for the head of the snake. Target acquired, the British flagship itself, the HMS Eagle. The plan was as bold as it was incredibly perilous. The lone pilot was to embark in the dead of night, furiously paddling this experimental craft toward the heavily guarded center of the massive British fleet. And he was doing all this knowing full well that the fate of the entire revolution might just depend on his success. The suspense of that night must have been absolutely agonizing. At exactly midnight, our lone pilot launches the stealth mission, slipping into the murky, swirling currents of the Hudson River. It is exhausting, back-breaking work. Fast forward to 2 a.m. Against all odds, the pilot successfully navigates the turtle directly beneath the massive wooden hull of the flagship Eagle. He's right there. The target is literally right above his head. 3 a.m. brings the critical moment. He reaches up in the dark and begins to frantically crank the hand-operated drill, trying to bite into the wood to attach the timed torpedo. He tries, and he tries, but as the clock ticks relentlessly toward 5 a.m., the early morning light starts to approach. The absolute crucial cover of darkness is rapidly fading. He has no choice. He has to execute a hasty retreat. So what exactly went wrong at 3 a.m.? Why did he have to pull back? Well, it all came down to one massive, entirely unforeseen technical snag. The pilot got underneath the Eagle, he raised his hand-cranked drill, pushed upward, and nothing. The drill wouldn't bite. It just stopped. It completely failed. Why? Because right underneath the water, the hull of the HMS Eagle wasn't just wood, it was reinforced with solid metal. After all that pedaling, all that incredible stealth, all that immense risk, the drills simply could not pierce the metal plating. And the morning light brought absolute chaos. As the pilot makes his desperate, hasty retreat, he gets spotted. British longboats quickly launch and begin actively pursuing this weird bobbing contraption in the water. To save himself, and more importantly, to save this highly classified craft from capture, the pilot takes a drastic action. He rips off and releases the heavy gunpowder keg just to drop weight and gain some much-needed speed. The consequence of that choice? Well, that heavy torpedo eventually floats down the river and explodes. And while it didn't hit a ship, the sheer concussive force of the blast sent a massive, stunning column of water rocketing high into the air, completely shocking the onlookers watching from the New York shore. So the crucial point is, even though the turtle didn't actually sink the HMS Eagle that day, it was far, far from a failure. What we're looking at is a truly legendary leap in warfare. It beautifully showcased raw American innovation under the most extreme pressure imaginable. It proved to the entire world that a simple wooden barrel and a crazy, bold idea could legitimately challenge the mightiest empire on Earth. The turtle shifted the entire paradigm. It proved that the threat wasn't just on the surface of the water anymore. It quite literally changed the face of naval combat forever. And that brings us to the end of our explainer today. We've seen the absolute desperation, the astounding, out-of-the-box engineering, and the sheer, almost unbelievable bravery it took just to execute this mission. Now, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. Knowing everything we just discussed together, the intense claustrophobia, the thick black tar, the grueling physical exhaustion of peddling a literal bomb underwater in the pitch dark toward a heavily armed enemy fleet, would you have volunteered to pilot the turtle? Just take a second to think about the monumental courage of that lone engineer. Thank you so much for joining me to uncover this fascinating hidden side of military history. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will catch you in our next explainer.